Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Rise of Kyoshi by F.C. Yee. I'm gonna admit, until about the last quarter of this book, I was really wondering why I had heard nothing but gushing praise for it. Unless maybe it was just that, people's love of the original TV show bled over. Because, fans of things often love things that are attached to it just because it's part of the fandom. And I was enjoying this book. I never even vaguely considered DNFing it, but I wasn't seeing why everyone was absolutely so over the top in love with it. And now that I'm done, yeah, this book is fucking brilliant in so many ways. So The Rise of Kyoshi is about the Avatar Kyoshi. She's a figure that pops up in Avatar: The Last Airbender as a historical figure. She is the Avatar 2 before Aang. And this is the story of her coming into her power. We start with Kyoshi as a servant in the household of the teenage Avatar, Yun. Now, Yun is a friendly, charismatic, incredibly powerful earthbender, but he has yet to manage to bend any of the other three elements, which is, of course, the mark of the Avatar. But Jinzu and the other sages tasked with training him are determined to help him start firebending because they're sort of desperate for an Avatar. They need him to manifest into the full Avatar because without an Avatar as a mediator between the different nations and the protector of order in the world, there has been chaos. The last Avatar, Kuruk, died unexpectedly young, and in his absence, armies of bandits have been threatening the Earth Kingdom and the Water Tribe. They need a strong, fully realized Avatar to control the situation, and Yun is the option they have? Until one day, Kyoshi recites a poem Avatar Kuruk had composed, which she would have had no way of knowing unless she was actually the reincarnation of him rather than Yun. Now they have to figure out who is the actual Avatar, while bandits, pirates, and political intrigue threatens them on all sides. Okay, so right up front, there is that one thing that I found most intriguing when I started reading this book. If you know the Avatar world at all, you know Kyoshi was the Avatar, not some random kid named Yun, and you also know there is only one Avatar at a time, so it's not like they both could be. So there was the strong chance that the tension at the start of the book would have been completely undercut, because the question of who is the Avatar, it's answered before you even pick up the damn book. And in a way, yeah, that tension was undercut. There was very little tension in the question of who is Avatar, but that's because the tension is instead in how much is going to implode when it becomes undeniable that Kyoshi is the Avatar. And how is she going to handle it? And this is part of why I was wondering why people loved this book so much in the beginning. Because a lot of the work that was worked around that second question of how is what's going to happen when she becomes undeniably the Avatar, it just seemed like Kyoshi worrying over nothing, and the book never getting to the points that her worry could be actually valid. We never got to the serious worldwide conflicts that could come of this sudden revelation that they've had the wrong Avatar for years. But that's because that's not really what the book was doing, and so much of what's going on in that early section is actually set up for what's going to happen later. And the tension was mostly about just setting up characters and what Kyoshi would have to deal with once she finally accepted her status. And then there's the turning point when the book just becomes about something else entirely, and all that beautiful setup that had seemed a little disjointed and meandering when I was first reading it, suddenly it's insanely interesting themes. And these themes in this book, there's some in this book that I do not think I've ever read in any other fantasy book, especially not in YA fantasy, and some of the themes that are more common are just explored in such a different and wildly interesting way. A lot of this book is exploring how a person's power can be used as a tool by others. The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra both touch on small little arcs about people trying to basically control the Avatar as a way of controlling the world around them. But it's all pretty simple, like the level of, look, bad guy wants Aang to do things his way, so the gang runs away. Yay, next episode. It's pretty light. And this book took that little kernel of a theme and just ran with it. It takes the with great power comes great responsibility themes, combines them with classic Chosen One storyline elements, and adds on this complex net of people on a spectrum of good but flawed, all the way to seriously terrifying, all of whom are trying to take control of this young, inexperienced, but intensely powerful Avatar to shape the world they want. And Kyoshi has to deal with knowing that most people around her think they know more about the world than her, might actually know more about the world than her, know more about bending than her by far, and all have their own goals, which may or may not align with her goals. And she herself has to figure out who she wants to be as Avatar, and how she wants to shape this world. And it's just really fascinating. It's not something I've seen so thoroughly explored elsewhere. There's also something about the way Kyoshi's discovering and coming into her power is managed that it just felt very different than how that usually plays out in a book. Like, yeah, running from your power and denying it is pretty common. Like, that is sort of Chosen One narrative 101. But it feels like Kyoshi is just so disconnected from it. And she is the rare character that I actually buy the idea that she would not want the power to change the world until the world sort of forces her to want and need that power. And then there's the tale of vengeance, and like, tales of vengeance are not really my favorite tropes to read, and it's a really cliche trope right now. Like, it's very common, especially in YA, and especially in YA featuring a female lead. It's like people don't think women can be strong, badass fighters unless they're, you know, out for vengeance. But it doesn't fall, but this book at least doesn't fall into a lot of these cliche traps. Like, I love the fact that she never loses her urge for vengeance. She just has to accept that other things are more important at this moment. Like, she'll get back to that. And the way the end was handled was so cool. Like, one of the things I don't like about Tales of Vengeance is I sort of feel like they have one of two endings. Either the hero is going to meet the bad guy and suddenly realize that vengeance won't fix anything and finally decide to let there be mercy. Or the opposite side of that is the hero meets the bad guy, kills him, and then afterwards there's some weird emotional moralizing about, like, vengeance fixed nothing. And that's not what's going on here. Like, Kyoshi does have big feels, and some of them feel adjacent to that, but they're just different enough to keep me really interested in her as a character. I also would like to say that this has some of the most unusual handling of target age range I have ever seen. And, like, this book definitely did have a target age range problem, because the book is written as, I'm pretty sure it's meant to be YA, and it feels like it's an older YA, but written with the assumption that a good percent of the audience is going to be actual adults who grew up reading or watching Avatar and are now, you know, 40-year-old millennials. But it still has to acknowledge the fact that because its source material, the canon it's building on, is a cartoon aimed at 10-year-olds, some kids are going to pick up this book. And that leads to a really difficult line. Like, who are you writing the book for? Are you writing it for the 10-year-olds? Are you writing it for, you know, actual YA audience? Or are you writing it for the adults that grew up reading the book, or watching the cartoon? And I think this book did a really interesting job of dealing with that. There's a lot that's skirted around, while other bits are just straight up smashed into your face, and it's like, nope, here are some adult themes, deal with it. And a good example of this, like, the romance is really lightly handled. It's all about feelings. There's nothing that could even be called sexual at all. Like, it's sweet, and I really love how much the emotional buildup is really explored and played with, and, like, we see a lot of deep emotions from it. But the most physical contact we see is hugging and kissing. And I think it's literally like 3 kisses throughout the book. And there's a moment that I'm pretty sure we were meant to assume the characters probably did something akin to at least heavy petting, but it's a fade to black scene with a waking up in each other's arms in public moment. So it's fair to assume they weren't having sex, or if they were, that was, you know, a choice. But the important thing is, like, a kid could read that and have no idea that the adults might be wondering, did they have sex? We don't know. And there's also a lot of random references to sexual things, but we're talking about the kind of back-of-hand joke that appear a lot in kids' books and kids' media, where, you know, there's references to something sexual that if you already know what it is, you'll get it and go, ha, that's a joke for the parents. But the kids will not even notice it's there. And there is one moment I feel like it doesn't quite work. There's a moment in the beginning of the book where they're playing a game where they recite bawdy poems, and, like, everybody tries to guess who you're talking about, and, like, all the other characters are treating the songs and poems as if they're really naughty, and oh my god, you're saying naughty things, how dare you? And, like, I kept going back and rereading it and rereading it and rereading it, because I couldn't find anything actually naughty in there. They were literally just describing people, and at least unless I missed it, they're not describing, you know, naughty bits. So it's all just sort of like, okay. And, like, to me, that's sort of the exact opposite of the effect you want. You want it to be the sort of thing that you will slide past it if you don't get it, and you won't even notice there's a sexual joke there. Whereas this is drawing your attention to it, and you're getting the feeling that there's supposed to be a sexual joke there, and I couldn't find it. So I feel like that was not a successful moment, and it's a sad thing because that moment is actually really important to the plot. But other than that, I felt like it really worked. I sort of really like the fact that it felt for a minute like we were headed towards that classic YA love triangle, and then, oh my god, that's not where we went at all. And I'm still sort of hopeful that we will get some of that in the touch of the not a love triangle in the sequel, but I can't really talk about it without major spoilers, so we're gonna just move on to the violence. Because, yeah, the other side of the bridge between YA, adult, and middle grade is the violence. And holy hells, is this book violent! It's all right there. It's on page. It's bloody. It's occasionally a bit gruesome. And it was just a lot more than I expected. Like, The Last Airbender does have implied violence. We know there was a fucking genocide. Like, you're not avoiding that fact. And so we know people are killed. We know there's death. There are famously some characters who are killed on screen, and some that we are just left wondering if they're dead or not, like, is Jet dead? But there's never any blood. It's kept very clean. And this book, nah man, people are straight up getting impaled, getting rock shot through them, getting tortured to death, getting poisoned, getting eaten, getting shot with arrows, getting burned. And the book doesn't dwell on it, but it also isn't shying away from any of this. And that's just a bit of a surprise to me of how much was in here. But I do feel like this is the perfect level of evolving the implied adult themes from the original cartoon into the full exploration of them that I crave as an adult. There was always so much really interesting depth to the Avatar world. Questions like the sacredness of human life, the responsibility to take the path of lesser evil, power, privilege, and how people use might to make right, as well as the weight put on children. These are all major themes of the cartoon, and all of these things are explored in this book in depth, and the depth I would like and expect for an adult audience. So overall, I think it does manage to bridge a gap that if a 10-year-old picks this up, I wouldn't be horrified. But it's clearly aimed at the people who, you know, watched the cartoon when they were younger and have now grown up. Also, the moment of spook at the end was legitimately chilling, and I cannot wait to know exactly what's going on with that. Though, of course, I already have my theories, and I'm assuming it's going to be covered in book 2, but who knows? Also, Kyoshi's character arc is just fascinating. She goes from not thinking of herself as important and reveling in that lack of importance, to not caring what people think of her actions as long as she does what she needs. And I really love this because it makes sense as an arc. She never really cared about what people thought of her, just how they acted towards her. And she goes from her weakness keeping her separate from those around her to her strength doing the same thing. And she never loses that core element of her personality, the separation. And it really captured what we know of Kyoshi from the cartoons, and also lets us see how she grew into the Kyoshi we knew in the cartoons. And like, her arc is just exactly what I feel like a character arc should be. Evolving, changing, but remaining the same character. It doesn't feel like she's somebody completely new at the end of the book. And I don't know how to explain this, but I feel like there's something poem-like about this book, and not in the normal way. Like, yeah, the prose was lyrical at moments, and like there's a lot of, you know, focus on pretty, whatever, but there's just this intense focus on one moment, and then a stepping back and a focus on another. And like, there's a distinct rhythm to the attention that is just subtly more distinct than I'm used to seeing in books. It almost feels like sometimes we are going from a distant third to a close third perspective to the distant and back again, and that's where the rhythm is coming from. And I don't think I've ever seen anything like it in any book before. Also, the writing was just gorgeous quite often. Sometimes I will admit the sentence structure felt a little backwards or out of order or just striking in a different way. Like there was something about it that felt a little bit like it was translated from a language that had a different sentence structure than English. And it felt a lot like reading translated poetry. And so it took me a bit to get used to, but it all feels like it fits the world. And because, of course, we have the Avatar world to play in. This is what got me to pick up this book. This is what I wanted to read, because it is such a cool playground. I mean, it sounds pretty simple. 4 nations, the giant Earth Kingdom, polar tribes of Water Tribe at the North and South Pole, the militant Fire Nation, and the incredibly peaceful Air Nomads. Pretty simple. They manipulate one element each. Not everybody has the power to manipulate the elements. That's called bending. It's like martial arts, but you gotta have a talent for it. But there are just so many little fun elements about the world that we get to see explored more thoroughly in this book. And there's a lot of little nods to the original series, like the Cabbages. There are mentions of groups we saw in the original series, the Qin, the Ganjin, the Zhang, but also this is around 400 years before what we saw of Aang coming into his power. And even in the original series, we saw little nods to the fact that the culture of this world is ever evolving, ever changing, like it is in the real world, and that gives the author of this book a good bit of room to play with. We get a full immersion into culture, traditions, and government structures that we saw in passing in the cartoon. And we also get an entirely new set of traditions that are specifically around how the Avatar is treated, educated, and generally thought of before the 100 years without an Avatar that happened when Aang was missing. And I really like the way it feels like the traditions we see have weight. They feel like they had been built up generation after generation after generation, and them crumbling even a little bit feels like it has weight, like it's going to cause the world to crumble, even though most of these are traditions we saw nothing in Aang's timeline. So for us, they feel really new, but within the world, they feel incredibly well established. Now, to the things that had me thrown in the beginning, the thing that really struck me the most when I was first starting reading this book that just sort of broke my mind for a little bit, I've heard a lot of people complaining about head hopping in books, and it's one of those things that I see people complaining about far more often than I see actual examples of the problem. Like, I can think of maybe 4 or 5 books I've read where there's a bit of head hopping, and usually it's like 1 or 2 moments that it really feels like the author just forgot whose perspective we were in for that scene. But this book has head hopping as a stylistic choice. By the way, if you don't know what head hopping is, it's where you are in a third-person perspective, but you can suddenly see bits of somebody else's perspective, so it's like you're suddenly hopping into their head. A lot of people hate it. But there are often 2 or 3 paragraphs every chapter in this book where we're suddenly just hearing thoughts of someone other than the perspective character. And sometimes it works. It's part of what gives that poetic rhythm that I was talking about with the changing of focus. That is part of what's causing this. But I will admit, sometimes it didn't feel like a choice, it just felt confusing. I find myself occasionally going, wait, who's thinking this? Like, who's worried? Who's watching this? I don't know whose perspective I'm in this moment. And especially in the first couple of times it happened, I would literally stop reading and, like, scan up the top of the page to be like, did I forget whose perspective I'm in? Because, like, there are multiple perspectives in the book. We have scenes from Kyoshi's perspective, Yun's perspective, and Janzu's perspective. So the moments that just drifted in the early days, it made me wonder if I'd missed a change in chapter or something. But there's also just a good there's a good number of what I think of as cringe moments. It's one of those things I really dislike that's very common in YA books. And it's a very specific kind of cringe that shows up in them. It's that moment when you know a character is about to make an absolute fool of themselves. And then, yeah, they do. And that's it. And it's one of those things that comes with a narrative of someone discovering their power and learning how to use it. And yeah, you do need to see moments where characters fail. I'm not sure you need to see these exact moments, but, you know, and you need them to try things and not succeed. But there's just that very specific, I'm big and strong now, I'm gonna take a stand in front of an audience, and you can tell a mile away it's going to go disastrously wrong, and it does, and I hate it, I don't like reading it, it makes me uncomfortable, and this book does have a good number of those moments. Also, I will admit the villain feel a bit cartoonish at moments, which I know feels a bit stupid to mention and complain about in a book that is based in a world based on a cartoon, but very little else in this book feels cartoonish. So it feels out of place when one character basically starts saying, I'm evil and you can't stop me, mwah ha 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 ha. And the good news is this was not the main antagonist of the book. The main antagonist, feels very well developed and really solid. I understood his motivations, why he did what he did, how he did what he did. It all makes sense. But there's a secondary villain that in many ways is a caricature of the main villain, and I know why he was a caricature. Like, I know that this was done to draw attention to the fact that the 2 men are very similar in many ways, but there are just like 2 moments that I expected him to turn to camera and twirl his mustache, and it felt a bit much. There's also the fact that the first third of the book is absolutely riddled with almost constant reminders that Kyoshi is huge. Like, thanks, I get it. She's like 7 feet tall. She's got big hands and feet. She's big. She's physically intimidating. It's really interesting element of her character, but I get it. You don't need to keep telling me. You could have told us maybe twice, and we would remember. But instead, every single scene she bumps her head on something, or the narration mentions that she barely fits in her room, or it mentions that she's so much taller than Ranji, and it's just like, okay, I get it. I do really like the fact that we never devolved to the moment where Kyoshi's just wishing she was a small, delicate girl so people would find her more attractive. Like, I would have been absolutely angry if they did that. But for a while, it felt like every single scene needed at least 3 reminders that she's really fucking tall. And it did not. Also, there were a couple of action sequences that I felt didn't really work as well on page as they would have on screen. Like, it was either hard to follow, or it just sounded a bit silly, but would have looked really cool if it had been animated. But also, on the action elements, Kyoshi's constant focus on neutral Jing, the way it transitioned into only seeming neutral while holding up the world was just, oh my god, it was perfect. That was one of those moments that I would have killed to have written something like that. That was absolute glory on the page. But overall, this is exactly what I would have said I wanted in an Avatar novel. More in-depth, exploring the darker elements that could only be touched on in the cartoons, but still feeling like Avatar, like the world I fell in love with. Kyoshi is a great character. The world is expanded in a way that feels natural, not like someone else is trying to put their stamp on an already built world. The writing is fascinating, even at moments I disagreed with the choices. I was like, this is a really interesting choice, and it made me want more. And luckily, there is a second book. And then there's the violence. Oh God, cat, please. Yes, there's a bug. Please, guys, I need you not to be here.